Yeah.
Hi, thanks. That was great. It sounds like we've got lots of good examples of democracies that died that map pretty well onto what we're experiencing. In your research, have you also found examples of democracies that were terminally ill but turned it around, that can sort of serve as a playbook for us from here on out?
Yeah, that is a great question. I would not call U.S. democracy terminally ill. We look, again, getting back to the last question about gatekeeping. There have been, it's been a long time, and most of us have seen very little of this in our lifetime, but it's been a long time since there were numerous extremist, anti-democratic candidates and parties floating around. But go back to the 1920s and 30s. Maybe Daniel should be answering this question because this is what he works on. And there were a lot of them. Several important European democracies were destroyed by, as Daniel described in his talk, by the rise of extremist candidates and parties, almost invariably in alliance with mainstream politicians. But there were democracies that avoided that fate. There were democracies where conservative parties said no and refused to strike up a line, even if it was electorally beneficial, or they calculated that it might be electorally beneficial. Conservative parties kept extremists at a distance. One of them is Belgium. Another one is Finland. Those are two cases in which extremists were kept at bay. It was an extremely polarizing period in the late 20s and 1930s, but democracy survived, at least until the Nazis arrived in Belgium.
Yeah, so if you want to hear more about the stories by the book, we tell great stories about Belgium and Finland. But there's also cases, and this is maybe less hopeful, cases of democracy being rebuilt after trauma. And so we also tell stories about the rebuilding of Chilean democracy after Pinochet, as well as the rebuilding of German democracy, West German democracy after 1945. And, it's not automatic that these processes of redemocratization would take place. Certainly these are cases and experiences where people only overcame their differences in the face of trauma, major trauma. And so the question is, can we learn from those cases? I think we can. But can we learn from those cases without having to undergo that trauma ourselves?
Can I just make one more comment about the terminally ill thing? That was a good question, and I didn't mean to make light of the issue. Again, I don't think that American democracy is terminally ill. But all of us, including me, have throughout our lives made the mistake, I think, of taking the stability of American democracy for granted. We're an old democracy, we're a successful democracy, we're a stable democracy, so most of us haven't worried about it. And our politicians, our pundits, our media don't think much about the consequences of really reckless, irresponsible behavior. And that's a mistake because because democracy can die. So even if we're not terminal right now, it's clear that there are warning signs. It's clear that our democracy is not functioning the way it should. It's clear that there are threats on the horizon. And so that's why it's really important that we take lessons, one, from democratic failures, but also, as the question implied, from cases that manage to turn things around.
I always think that there's like two forms of capitalism here. We have capitalism in Cambridge and New York City and LA, but there's a whole different form of capitalism in the Rust Belt. And as somebody who's had to drive around the country a lot, and I've driven to Ohio back and forth, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 times in the last 10 years, and I would go to these country areas and the back roads and I would see all this poverty and this disconnected poverty. And I would see all the problems with addiction and opiate, and I'd say, wow. And I would come back to Cambridge and I'd say, do you know what's going on in New York State? Do you know what's going on in rural Ohio? And they would say, no, we have no idea. And I'd say, you will, at some point. So I wasn't surprised at all by Donald Trump's election because of the anger that I saw in the Rust Belt. And it's something you're not even mentioning, the money. And, you know, I always think it's the money, stupid, you know. They're not making as much money, the economy isn't doing well, and they're completely ignored by the powers that be. So why aren't you bringing up the money? That's my question.
Yeah, you're right. We didn't mention this in our talk. In the book, we do have a description. I think you're absolutely right that one of the another way to put the point that you've made is that a driving force of this is rising levels of inequality, economic inequality, and we're currently living, as you all know, in a period of inequality that's unmatched since any time since the late 19th century, early 20th century. And so this is something that has certainly made our politics much more vulnerable to these kinds of upsurges. And this is a global phenomenon. It's happening everywhere in advanced democracies. And so one extra point, though, that I would add to this is, and how this ties into the argument we've been making so far, is that it's the combination in many ways of this rising economic inequality and increasingly diverse society that makes the politics of backlash so dangerous and so tempting for politicians to take advantage of. And so when particular groups are targeted because of this rising disaffection with the economy, for good, there's good reasons to be disaffected from the economy, but it takes the form of anti-immigrant sentiment and so on. And one of the kind of mental experiments that I sometimes imagine is, had the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, which passed in the 1960s, as well as immigration reform, which passed in the 1960s, had this all happened in the late 40s, say, and 50 years of robust economic growth followed from this, we wouldn't have experienced the same kind of antagonisms that we're experiencing today. And so what in fact happened, our real history is these reforms passed, helped democratize America, and within several years the global economy shifted, and so it's the slowdown in the global economy. So it's the combination of these dynamics that I think have left us in a very vulnerable position.
And this is something the Democrats can do, right? The Democrats have really dropped the ball over the last quarter century on inequality. Democrats, like center-left parties elsewhere, are supposed to be the party of the little guy. They're supposed to be the party of redistribution. And since the early 1990s, this has been basically off the agenda of the Democratic Party. And so one thing that the Democrats can do is actually push seriously for policies to redistribute wealth, which really, we've had 16 years of Democratic administrations in the last quarter century that have done almost nothing to combat a steady rise in income inequality.
Well, I think you may have just answered my question, but you described what we're undergoing now as polarization, which kind of implies, in the logic of it, that both poles are equally at fault, equally extreme. And yet, as you just mentioned, we have one of the poles, which whose leadership is now describing as too extreme for them, policies that are very popular with their base and which were mainstream democratic politics in the 70s, like just a living wage, a minimum wage that's a living wage, or expanding access to Medicare. So I was going to ask you to comment on that, but maybe you just did.
We argue very clearly in the book that this is an asymmetric polarization. This is a polarization that's being driven by an extremist Republican Party. I think the evidence behind that is pretty clear.
Yeah, and something that some people have asked us about this on the Republican side and said, well, the Democrats, have some blame to share, and we emphasize in the book, and we think the historical record suggests that it began with the Republicans, but at some level, it's important to debate the history to understand what's going on, but we're now in a situation where there's the threat that both sides, there's a kind of threat of a spiral. And so in terms of the abiding by the procedures of democracy and the norms of democracy, and that's what we were about looking forward.
Yeah. One of the things that you guys mentioned towards the end of the book is how, if you look around the world throughout history, there really haven't been too many cases of a democracy with a non-homogeneous population being successful, with moral and racial equality. And, that kind of shocked me, at first, and then I started thinking about it. And do you think maybe just with the U.S., is the U.S. too big? Is it too diverse? Is there too much going on to really tap into that and have a functioning democracy in that way.
So here's my ray of hope. One of the reasons why we actually think that the democracy that we built in this country, really beginning in 1965, is pretty unique and pretty special. It combines an old and effective constitution with an experiment, at least important steps towards racial equality in a diverse society, which is almost unique in the world. And I actually think that, I personally think that the combination of still very strong democratic institutions with a history of at least some success in ethnic assimilation and integration, for all of the horrible performance of this country and this society on issues of race and, at times, treatment of immigrants, I think a pretty good case can be made that everybody else has done worse. I think if there's a country that has a shot in the decades to come at establishing itself as a truly multi-ethnic democracy, it's ours.
In the last election cycle, it was clear that people on both sides of the aisle felt very disenfranchised, that their preferences were not being taken into account and were not making a difference at the end of the day. I was curious if you could comment on this, and something that maybe you didn't comment on was the amount of money in politics and corporate interests and the way that those potentially have led to some of that disenfranchisement. Or maybe in your research you looked at some countries that have more than two parties, or that rely on referendums or other kind of democratic institutions for people to be able to have an impact at the national level.
Yeah, good, very good question. I think you're right that there is, there's evidence across, it's not just the United States, it's across, again, advanced democracies. There's growing disaffection with mainstream political parties, and parties are transforming all around the world. There's new parties springing up in Spain. The current governing party in Spain is about to collapse, and there's new parties, and this all, and in Italy as well, so all around the world. And this comes from some deep sense that democracies aren't delivering. So, to what is this driven by? There's lots of factors at work. Economic inequality is certainly one part of this. But I think also in the United States in particular, political parties are supposed to express people's interests and preferences about politics, and there's a disconnect. And I think part of the problem is that parties have been hollowed out to a large degree. We think of parties as being very strong, but American political parties are quite weak. And in particular, they've lost control of money, and they've lost control of the message. So with the opening up of campaign finance, this means that outside groups are able to shape the political agenda in ways that normal citizens can't, number one. And number two, with the transformation of media, there's a way in which parties, newspapers used to be named after parties, the Press Democrat. And so there was a kind of way in which parties and media were closely connected, and so voters identified with newspapers, identified with parties. But there's a way in which parties have lost control over debate. And so there's a disconnect then as a result of this. So I think again, this comes back to a theme I mentioned before, that I think political parties are an invention of the late 19th century. They need to be reinvented for our current age.
Professor Ziblatt, I'm in your current Politics of Europe class, and yesterday in lecture you mentioned that history can be described as periods of punctuated equilibrium, and where we have moments where there are critical opportunities to make choices, and then our choices become sticky, and we end up on a specific path. Do you believe we're still in that critical period, or are we already on a set path?
Yeah, good question. Good.
Dang Harvard students.
Yes, right. Yeah, well, one of the things about this is that often it's hard to know if one's in one of these moments, and it's easier for historians to identify you're in a period of opening. I think our political system runs on multiple streams. So there's certain things that are open, there's other things that are not. One thing that is very sticky is our Constitution. It's very hard to change our Constitution. So, there's people ask about the Electoral College and, changing the Senate, and, there's all sorts of kind of proposals that people can dream up of why our 18th century antiquated Constitution is something we should just junk. But it turns out it's very hard to change American political institutions in particular. So I think that's very sticky. I think something that's not sticky and something where there is a potential for opening now. And I don't know, Steve may disagree on this, but that a kind of realignment of the political parties. You know, we have these two parties, we kind of know what they stand for, but there's a sense in which increasingly I attend events with moderate Republicans where they're talking to Democrats, and there's things are in flux when it comes to party realignment. And this has happened in American history, where you have parties shifting. In the 1960s, there was a kind of big shift in the parties. The 1850s, Lincoln was, began the Republican Party, the modern Republican Party. So there's a way in which, because of all this flux in the party landscape, the idea of a third party coming along and challenging the two main parties, there's maybe more opportunity and there's a bigger opening there than we might imagine.
So I don't agree with that. But I can let me play an imaginary game and point to what might have been a critical juncture. I mean, I'm very worried about the way that our party system, the dynamic of our party system today, in which the Republicans represent a declining white Christian, very homogeneous white Christian, what used to be a majority, now minority. I think as long as that dynamic holds, eventually this will get them into electoral trouble. Nobody knows exactly when they'll become the Californian Republican Party. If they continue, it will happen, but they can do a lot of damage between now and then. So it's really problematic that they got on this path. After losing the 2012 election, the Republican Party leadership thought very seriously about what it could do to become a more diverse party. They did this autopsy, and they thought seriously about making the changes that we argue is critical to reducing polarization in this country. They're also becoming a country that deals with a 21st century diverse society, that can live in such a society. Because, as Daniel correctly pointed out, there is no Republican Party leadership. It's completely hollowed out. There's no establishment that can impose that vision, impose that lesson, impose that line. It was just a hollowed out party that Donald Trump was able to grab and pull in another direction. Had they actually had a real party leadership that could impose that vision of a more diverse party, we would not be hurling in the direction we're hurling today.
You've addressed this somewhat, but when the framers were putting this government together, they looked at this issue of democracies going all the way back to the beginning of time, I guess the Greeks or whatever, and they determined that the biggest threat to this particular democracy would be the growing inequality between the haves and the have-nots. So as I said, you seem to have addressed that, but you didn't mention it in your lecture, so that's why I got to ask the question. But you're saying that this this democracy is not terminally ill, but at the same time you suggest that the system of checks and balances is possibly not equal to the challenges and threats to the system. So I'm just wondering if you feel as though maybe the time has come for a new constitutional convention, or do you think that's going a little bit too far?
Yeah, so I think our checks, good question, thank you. I think our checks and balances, some of our checks and balances are working better than others. So I think our legal system is working quite well, our judiciary is working quite well. Social institutions, media is working as robustly, New York Times subscriptions are up and so on. Our Congress is not working well. I mean, our Congress is supposed to be a guard dog of our democracy and constrain the power of the president. And the guard dog has turned into a lapdog. And so it's not serving its constitutional role. And I think part of this is driven by polarization and the radicalization of the Republican Party, in which the Congress sort of turns into a shield for the president when it's the same party, and a weapon when it's the other party. I don't think that we should have, I'm nervous about, and there is movement for constitutional conventions, but I sort of would want to issue a warning about this. I mean, there's lots of discussion, it turns out, for proposals for constitutional convention where states could propose, call for a constitutional convention, and there's a kind of different route through which a constitutional convention could be called. What makes me nervous about this is you have to imagine at that constitutional convention who's going to be at the table and what kind of agenda is going to be pushed. And I think it's possible that there's things that we can imagine ought to be changed in our national government, but if you kind of open the door, who knows what will come out of this. And so I think it's a very dangerous kind of prospect. That said, I think there is the opportunity for institutional kind of being creative with institutions, but I think a lot of that should take place at the state level, and that's actually what's happening. In California, for instance, there's there was a kind of redesign of the way that electoral districts are drawn. Rather than having the state legislature do this, so that they just sort of gerrymander safe seats for themselves, a neutral administrative body was set up to do this. And so these kinds of experiments are taking place in Maine with changes in electoral systems. So a lot of this kind of experimentation can take place at the state level, and that's maybe where this kind of process should begin.
I'm from the Philippines, and when you follow the news, you could easily conclude that the warning signs that you were talking about is pretty much present in the behavior, for example, of the Philippine president. So my question or my interest is, does your research or your book have insights to offer in terms of like dealing or responding to our context where political systems or political parties are weaker compared to, like, for example, the context of the United States?
That's it's a great question. We don't have a lot of solutions in terms of how to save democracies in crisis. I think if I did, I'd have a better paying job. I mean, you know, Philippines is a country with, as you said, weak political parties and relatively weak institutions. So a demagogue with a weak commitment, this is not going to be a happy, there's no happy ending in what I'm about to say. A demagogue with a weak commitment to civil liberties and to constitutional norms can do a heck of a lot more damage a lot more quickly in the Philippines than in the United States, because the sort of robust judiciary and press, I mean, it's not extremely weak in Philippines, but it's much weaker than here. So it's a president can do much more damage much more quickly. It takes robust opposition, particularly when institutions are weak. Really, the only way of stopping them is through society. It takes civil society, takes opposition parties, trade unions, human rights groups, people power to stop an abusive president.
We've gone a bit over time, so this will be our final question of the evening.
So I was in Gov 20 with you last semester, Professor Levitsky, and now I'm in Politics of Europe with you, Professor Ziblatt. So,
Glutton for punishment.
So my question was, in Gov 20 you talked a lot about the incentives that politicians and parties and voters have for certain actions that they take. And when you were talking about how one of the solutions for the polarization would be for the Republican Party to stop representing mainly the sort of white Christian group that used to be a majority, what incentives do you think people have in the party to do that? Because it seems that I'm not able to think of any sort of events that could spark that. It seems that before it was historical events, like you mentioned, the civil rights movement, that sort of diversified party affiliation across, religions and ethnicities and race. So I was wondering.
It's a great question. First and foremost, it would take an electoral spanking. The problem right now is that the current Republican Party strategy has got them in control of the presidency, the Senate, the House of Representatives, 30-plus governor's mansions, and they're about to have a pretty solid grip on the Supreme Court as well. So it seems to be working pretty well. It's actually not working as well as it seems. They've lost the popular vote in two of the last 4 victories. But and they know, in fact, that this electoral strategy, that what is essentially a racially conservative appeal, cannot win in the medium run. They know that very well. This is one of the arguments that David Frum is making in his book, Trumpocracy. The Republicans are very aware of the fact that that if they continue down this path, they face a very, very tough electoral future, which is one of the reasons that they're starting to cheat. No, that's David Frum. It's not me. So the clearest incentive is to lose badly. Had Hillary Clinton won by 10 percentage points the 2016 election, there would be a lot of soul searching going on in the Republican Party. The problem is that, again, the Republicans don't really have a party. They don't really have a national party leadership. This is a decentralized party, and in much of the country, many of the congresspeople And the senators that are coming to Washington are coming from deep red states or districts. So even if the Republican Party takes a thumping at the national level, they're still going to do quite well in much of the territory. And so it's going to take an electoral beating that's so bad that it pervades not only North Carolina and Virginia, but South Carolina.
And we are basically out of time, so I'll have to ask for a very, very brief question and a very, very brief answer.
I just wanted to say that I think everybody ought to read and think about the points you raised in your book, but in particular, the Congress of the United States needs to read it and think about it. I don't know the best way to do this, but if somebody wants to load up a cargo plane with a few thousand copies of How Democracies Die, I would be glad to contribute to the effort.
We can give a short answer and say we agree. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our speakers this evening. Thank you to all of you for being here. As I said in my introduction, we have books available for purchase outside the doors. If you'd like to get a book signed tonight, you can line up down this aisle to my right, and the signing will be right up here on stage in just a moment. Thank you for coming.